Okay. All right. So I was talking to a patient the other day. We kind of went through how insurance and medicine kind of is that corporate practice of medicine thing is kind of expanded. And they were like, you should totally talk about this on your podcast. So I will. First of all, the numbers I'm using are just to get an idea. Second of all, this isn't how it always works, but this is a big part of one of the problems with medicine. So you'll kind of understand what's going on as we go. All right. So when we start looking at, why the drugs what drugs are chosen, things like this, you have to understand a lot of times, not always, a lot of times doctors are more technicians than they are just, people figuring out what's going on and selecting what they want for you. And what I mean by that is you come in with, problem, disease, symptom X. And what ends up happening is that they're taught, when you see this thing, here are your choices of medications for this problem. Okay. And so as they go through, they're like, okay, you have this thing, we're going to give you these meds, which is why a lot of times if you go see 3 different doctors, they all recommend the same drugs or the same procedure or the same tests, because they're like, if you have this thing, here's a protocol that you follow, and you have to follow the protocol, or else you get in lots of trouble, you lose your license, you go to jail, that sort of thing. We'll go into that later. And so that's how they kind of choose their drugs. Well, what people don't know is that a lot of times the insurance companies make those decisions. Now, people don't understand about how insurance companies are set up. So they think that there's an insurance company they pay premiums to, and then they pay the pharmaceutical companies, they pay the doctors, they pay all the people. And, so the insurance companies kind of help manage how much things cost. And that's not actually how it is anymore. The insurance company owns the insurance premiums that you're paying them. They own the doctor's offices. They own the laboratory function. They own the pharmaceutical, the pharmacies. They choose what drugs are used all the way through. They make money off all those things. So what ends up happening is that, so you go to the doctor, and a lot of these doctors that are now part of a corporate group. They've sold to a larger group. They're now, however you want to put it. They're no longer the doctor owning his own little spot, or you go to the hospital, and the hospital, they work for the hospital. A lot of these hospitals, a lot of these doctor groups are owned by the pharmaceutical companies. I'm sorry, not the pharmaceutical companies, by the insurance companies. So you go to the doctor and you go, doc, I got this issue. Well, what happens is that the insurance companies tell the people at the top, the administrators for the hospitals and for whoever's running with the docs, they say, okay, for these issues, you have these 5 options that you can prescribe, but insurance is only going to cover these 3 drugs, and we're going to cover this one drug really, really well. So it's going to be the cheapest option. And so they tell the docs, hey, here are the 5 options. We really recommend that you give one of these 3 because they're covered by insurance, and so your patients will be happier. And so just please do this. Otherwise, patients are going to be pissy, which makes sense. And so they're like, all right, we'll pick these 3. They're like, hey, and if you can, use this one because it's going to be cheapest for the patient. Fantastic, right? So far, it sounds great for the patient. Okay. Well, the way that works is that, so now the doctors get all these people in, they run the tests they're supposed to run, which pays the hospital and the whole deal. Insurance doesn't necessarily make a ton of money off of your visit to the doctor. So they're not getting the doctor got paid $75, the insurance company took 20 of it. That's not how it works. The docs make their stuff. The insurance companies that own those doctors' offices, they pay the docs on how many visits did you do and how many prescriptions did you write. It's not necessarily how many prescriptions did you write, but if you talk to the docs who work for the hospitals, if you spend 3 days not writing any prescriptions, you get yelled at and been like, how are you not doing this? Plus, they get in a lot of trouble. So if you come in, your cholesterol's 1 point high and they don't write you a statin drug, they can get in trouble for that. So that's one of the reasons they want as many people through as they can, because they know they have locked in prescriptions that are going to go. And then if the insurance companies own the doctor's offices and they force 30 people a day, and they know they're going to get specific prescriptions written, and they're going to make money off those drugs because they own all those drugs. How do they do that? Through something called the physician's benefit managers, or the pharmacy benefit managers, the PBMs. So what PBMs used to be was this PBM would set up and they'd be like, oh, we think that these 5 drugs are going to be used a whole lot. So those pharmacy benefit managers would then go to the pharmaceutical companies and go, hey, look, I know this pill costs $1, but if we buy 1 million pills instead of $1 million, could you charge us $800,000? So 20% discount. And they're like, sure, that sounds great. And they go, hold on. what if we promise to buy 1 million pills for 3 years in a row? They're like, oh, well, that's recurring revenue. That's super great. Instead of 80% off, 20% off, we'll give you 30% off. All right, great. So now they're making 30% off. Fantastic. So, right. So, and that's going to end up being the drug they recommend everybody buy because they're getting a bigger discount on it because they're buying it in more volume. Fantastic. Anyway, so then, you patient go to the pharmacy that the insurance company owns, and the pharmacy goes, hey, look, this pill that, costs the insurance company 70 cents. They're like, it's $9 a pill. However, because you got great insurance, it's only, $1.50 with your insurance. So you're still covering the whole cost of it, and the insurance company pays the pharmacy the $9. But since the insurance company owns the pharmacy, it doesn't really matter where that money goes. So you're still paying $1.50 for something that they paid 70 cents for. Again, that shouldn't be a problem. That's how money is made. So just keep that in mind. Well, so what ends up happening is that now they can then go to the, every year when you talk about premiums, most people don't pay their premiums, or companies do, or the government does. And so what they end up doing is the insurance companies go to the employer and they go, hey man, your people, like, they got sick and they used a lot of drugs. And those drugs were expensive. And so we're going to raise your rates. And so they go, all right. And so they raise the rates. And so the rates go on to the consumers. And so the amount you're paying per month goes up. The amount that you're paying for drugs goes up. The amount the companies and the government are paying goes up. And so every year. And that will continue to go up until people decide that they're not going to pay for it anymore. And the amount of people who are paying into the system and the people who are stopped paying the system balances out. And so we get this kind of flat line of profit growth. We'll go into that in a second too. And so that's why these things are going to keep getting more and more expensive. So that's kind of how that whole system works. Now, if you look at like during COVID, and this is why the insurance companies making these decisions is a bad plan, because during COVID, the push was not to make people better. The push was to let people die, to make COVID look super bad, and to really emphasize the point that we had nothing that would work for COVID, and we had to pass the Emergency Act to get the vaccine, which is why a lot of people didn't get monoclonal antibodies, because monoclonal antibodies knocked this thing out like crazy. I talked to a bunch of my politician buddies who told me that they felt like they were going to die, and then like they went in, they got drug in, and they got their monoclonal antibodies. And then the next day they were totally fine. Like one of them told me he went and worked out, had a great workout. The other one told me that he was going to go work out, but he thought he'd give himself one more day. But they were like 95% better the next day, from like horrible, miserable, terrible to completely fine the next day with monoclonal antibodies. Well, a lot of people didn't get monoclonal antibodies. They weren't allowed to. They weren't spread out because it was a phenomenal tool. And had everybody gotten them, people would have been like, well, the government would have said there's no reason for the emergency allotment of the vaccine. So they pulled those back and they didn't let people have them. There are doctors right now in Texas that are still fighting to stay out of jail to keep their licenses for using butazane. Butazane is a steroid that is for lung function. It's for asthma and stuff like that. It opens up the airways so that you can breathe better. Well, if you remember, COVID had a major respiratory component to it. So taking butazane was very beneficial. Taking ivermectin, because of the way ivermectin interacts with mRNA viruses, it actually was beneficial. Could we get ivermectin? No, that was very, very difficult. Nobody would prescribe it. And those who would prescribe it, the pharmacies, again, who owns the pharmacies, wouldn't fill it. And so we couldn't get ivermectin. Like I said, doctors were in trouble, doctors were getting fired, doctors were getting sent home for using things like butazane because it worked. Because the whole goal was to push as hard as they could to show nothing we have could even come close to helping. And so we have to go to the vaccine. So that was the whole push. So the issue with, having a group in charge of that whole thing that then makes money off of obviously death in this case, because the hospitals and the institutions who are owned by the insurance companies were getting paid for deaths, which is, you can go back and look, like the government was paying the hospitals for COVID deaths, which is why everybody was labeled as a COVID death, which also drove up the amount of people dying from COVID, making it look really, really bad. So we had to get to the vaccine. So that's one of the things that came in. And so that's kind of how the system works. So the insurance companies now own the premiums that you're paying them. They own the doctor's offices that are writing the scripts and doing the tests and figuring out what they're going to do. And then they own the pharmacies that are then filling those orders and sending all that stuff back to you. So they own every piece of this. And so it's a little bit difficult to figure out, well, where's the money going to stop? Well, here's the problem. They're like, oh, so they're like, I don't believe that a company would make decisions based solely on finances, and not on morals and ethics. Well, here's the issue. They legally have to. So a lot of people don't know this, but when you're on the board of a company, you have certain legal financial responsibilities. So if you're on the board of a publicly traded company, your primary legal goal is to increase return on investment back to the shareholders as much as possible. In fact, if you are found that you are doing something that you're knowingly doing something that is restricting financial income to the company, you can go to jail for that. So basically, if you're not trying to increase profits as much as possible, you can go to jail for that. So and the other thing is that these executives own shares of stock in the company. So the more money the company makes, the more money they make. So what ends up happening is that the board of directors for these insurance companies are told, if you don't maximize profits, you might go to jail. And if you do maximize profits, you're going to make a lot of money. So it's do these things that make money, you get paid. Don't do them, you go to jail. So that's kind of what they're looking at. Jail's probably not going to happen, but it's literally on the list of things that can happen to them. So that's kind of where we're at. And so herein lies the problem. So then who teaches the medical doctors to say and do what they do? Medical schools. Well, where do they get their information? From the CDC, the NIH, the pharmacy groups, things like that, who are doing the research. Well, if you've got the insurance companies owning the pharmacy benefit managers, owning the pharmacies, owning the doctor's offices, making all that stuff, who do you think's supplying the funding and everything else for this research? Insurance companies. Well, so here's the thing. So what happens if you have a drug? Let's just call it statin drugs. There's a lot of them. Let's just say there's one. So let's say that you have statin drugs, and all of a sudden the research comes back and goes, hey, statin drugs don't really help because the amount of cholesterol you have actually in research is showing it doesn't have anything to do with plaquing or heart attacks or strokes. What do you do if you find that out? Because if you find that out, but you're not forced to change, if you're the insurance companies and you do make the change and you radically reduce income, you can go to jail and you're not going to make any money. So that doesn't get pushed through. And so even though that research is out, what are they teaching the doctors? Well, they're teaching the doctors, keep prescribing statin drugs because cholesterol is the problem. So this reinforces bad ideology, bad research, and bad functionality to maintain drug sales, because if they don't, then the insurance companies lose money. And if they lose money because of decisions that the board makes, the board has legal issues with that. So you're never going to see something like a statin drug or an SSRI start to go away unless the government forces them to stop making it. Because if the government forces them, then the board can turn around and be like, there's nothing we can do. The government forced us to not sell this drug anymore. So that's kind of one of the problems that we have going on, is that we're getting bad information. We're prescribing drugs that are not helping, and a lot of times they're hurting. Again, statin drugs is a great example of this, because there is no functional way for the people who are in charge of it to make the change. So that's what's going on. So when you start seeing things, you're like, why does the research say this? Why do the functional medicine guys say this? Why do the physiologists say this? Why do the natural guys say this? But the medical community says this. Well, this is one of the big reasons why. So, if you're trying to figure out or trying to follow the money, this is the thing. So if you want to follow the money, look into the corporate ownership of doctors' offices by insurance companies, and you're going to have to go through like 9 or 10 shell companies before you find out, oh, it is managed by Aetna, it is managed by UHC. A lot of Medicare is managed via UHC or managed via BCBS, and so it's not the government who's managing it. The government's just giving the money over to the insurance companies. The insurance companies are then running their whole system the way they always do. So the insurance companies own the doctor's offices, they own the pharmacy benefit managers, a lot of cases they own the pharmacies. And so that's how all these things are going. And that's one of the big reasons. It's not obviously the only reason, but that's one of the big reasons that healthcare is functioning the way it does, and why we prescribe it, that all these drugs are being prescribed, that are showing little to, not that great benefit, and why we're not doing anything to reduce addiction. So for instance, we know that psychedelics 85% of the time will break addiction on the first try. So the reason that those are still illegal is because if we start breaking addictions like opioids and some of these other things, it will radically decrease sales. And that's where you're at. So that's kind of where a lot of this stuff is, because when you guys were wondering, like, I don't understand how the system works, and why does it seem like it gets more expensive every year, and yet our healthcare is getting worse, and people are getting worse, and we're prescribing more and more drugs, people are getting sicker and sicker. This is part of the problem. And so if you look at it like, well, why don't they just make better decisions? The decisions these insurance company people, the boards are making are with their legal parameters, are the best decisions they can be making. Because look at it. Like, their rule, again, is if they don't make more money, they could go to jail. And so they're like, well, how do we make the most money? And they just keep the system rolling. So unless the government does step in and say, we're going to start changing things, our healthcare is never going to get any better. So like all these things, people are like, oh my gosh, RFK is making crazy, like these big changes. That's why. So, this is some of the things that you have to understand. And that's why so many people are starting to leave the medical establishments. People are like, oh, we don't have faith and trust in the medical system anymore. It's not the medical doctors. Medical doctors are doing the best they can. Like, these guys are phenomenal human beings. The system that they're in, the administrative functional system that they're in, is creating a massive problem, because it's not about healthcare anymore. It's about income. And they've kind of got themselves locked in this system where if they're like, oh my gosh, we could change the healthcare of millions of Americans if we stopped doing this and started doing this. And they're like, well, what would happen? We'd lose a bunch of money. We can't do that, because if we make that decision as a company, we might go to jail because we're no longer providing the benefit for our shareholders. So this is one of the major issues where we're at. And this is why, like, hopefully this adds a little bit of idea of why the system works the way it does, and why so many doctors are leaving the system to become functional medicine doctors or concierge doctors. Because once they leave and they're like, I'm now a concierge doctor, I own my own practice, I have autonomy, they can then do a whole lot more of whatever they want to do. Now, the boards and everything are really cracking down on this. There's a 3-page thing that takes about 20 minutes to go through with a patient, that if you're going to offer them anything besides what the insurance company and this medical establishment has dictated, this is the way we do everything. You don't do any tests or any drug or any supplement outside of this. But if you want to do that because your patient's asking for it, you've got to fill out this giant piece of paper explaining what the medical establishment wants you to do, and then what you're going to do, and possible risks and benefits and things. And if you miss any of the possible risks or benefits on this side, the doctor can get in a lot of trouble. So they're doing everything they can to, in the medical, like, normal system, to hamstring and restrict the ability of concierge doctors, functional medicine doctors, and everybody to do what they're supposed to do. Because if you're paying for an hour of time with this doctor, and by law, they have to spend 20 or 30 minutes going over this form with you, well, there's going to be a whole lot less process done with you. It's going to be a whole lot more expensive. It's going to be a whole lot harder. So the more difficult the government can make this autonomous piece over here, the easier it's going to be to maintain function in the system. And so these are the type of things that we're all fighting against. And this is kind of where we're at. So that's kind of what's going on. So the people who are like, I don't understand the concierge thing, why are doctors leaving to become concierge? I don't understand, like, why am I getting the same recommendations from 3 different doctors from 3 different hospitals? This is more or less what it is. So, it's look into pharmacy benefit managers, look into corporate practice of medicine, look into the owner who's buying up all of these doctors' offices and can put them all in one big network. Look into that, because that's part of what's going on with your healthcare and why your healthcare is so expensive, and why it's now becoming to the point where paying cash is significantly cheaper year round than buying insurance and then paying the copays and deductibles and then paying the things that insurance doesn't cover. So that's why all these things are going where they're going, just as a kind of one of the reasons why all this is happening. So people ask me all the time. And so this is the reason, one of the reasons why. And so until these things get changed, it's just gonna be better off for you to find a doc who sits outside that system. So that's kind of how it is. That's where it goes. So if you guys have any questions, hit us up, questions@chalmerswellness.com, or talk to you guys on the phone. Have a great day.